All right, we're going to bring things back together. I hope that everyone enjoyed lunch. Yes? Thank you to our chefs. So it is now my pleasure to welcome Matt Gillard, President and CEO of Michigan's Children, a statewide early childhood advocacy organization. Matt is a strategic leader with extensive experience in high-level negotiation and policy development, and is dedicated to supporting implementation of relevant and innovative public policy. Matt?
Thank you, Denise, and thank you all for being here, for the work that you do, and for giving me a chance to talk. I am Matt Gillard. First of all, it's nice to see so many familiar faces in the room, but for those of you who I don't know, I'm a former state legislator. I did my sentence, I like to say. I served my 6 years. In Michigan, we have term limits. You can do 3 two-year terms in the state house. I did my 6 years from 2002 to 2008. I'm originally from the Alpena area. I represented the northeastern corner of the Lower Peninsula in our state legislature. And like I said, termed out at the end of 2008. I've been doing early childhood and childhood policy and advocacy work since. I worked for a number of years with the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, the Michigan Association of United Ways, and some others strictly on early childhood work. And now I've been at Michigan's Children for about 4 years. Michigan's Children is a cradle to career advocacy and policy organization. So I've expanded my work a little bit beyond early childhood, but still certainly am grounded and backgrounded into that in that model. And so I've lived through a lot of the wars with a lot of the folks in this room, and I want to talk about some of the stuff that's happening right now. I'm really going to kind of expand upon what Judy presented this morning, talk about what's actually happening. There's a lot happening right now around early childhood issues, both at the state and federal level. And I really want to answer questions that anybody has about anything that you're hearing or anything I talk about or even anything I don't talk about. I'm glad for the papers on the tables. I do talk fast. I get excited about this stuff. I like it. And I'm sure we'll use acronyms and jargon that may be unfamiliar to people. So please just stop me if I get going too fast. Hold up those papers. I'm completely comfortable with people just blurting out questions. If you're more comfortable raising your hand or waiting for me to stop, that's fine. But I speak fairly freely, and well, for those of you who know me, and we'll talk about where we're at right now and what some of the things that are happening in Michigan. So I'll start kind of with our state budget process. I'm going to flop back and forth between state and federal policy and discussions. I'll try to keep it clear for folks. We are in the midst of our state budget process right now. Michigan, in our Constitution, we have a requirement that the state passes an annual budget by October 1st. We run on October 1st fiscal year. And so this process starts with the governor presenting his or her budget proposal to the legislature. The legislature then works it through their process and submits it back to the governor, a final budget that's been approved by both the House and the Senate. In recent years, this has been done by the end of June. The Republicans in the legislature and Governor Snyder have kind of self-imposed a June 30th deadline for getting this work done. There's no reason to expect that they won't again this year. And we're right in the middle of that process right now. A couple of things I'll highlight. What's unique about this year is the big federal spending bill that just passed is adding some opportunities for us in that state budget process that I'll really highlight in a minute. But one thing that we did see in the governor's proposal and has been included in the Senate version that came out of the budget through the budget process right before spring break. The legislature's been on break the last 2 weeks. They're back in Lansing tomorrow to continue work, but we did see a Senate version come out right before spring break that also included was for the first time ever statewide money for Early On. Early On is our IDEA, here goes the acronyms, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act Part C program. This is an early intervention infant and toddler intervention program. In Michigan, we call it Early On. Every state is required to have one of these programs. We currently get about $11.8 million every year from the federal government to run that program. That $11.8 million is dispersed throughout the state through the ISDs, through the intermediate school districts, and is the extent of public funding federal or state public funding that has gone into that until recent years. Up until the Flint water crisis, the state had appropriated no money for early on for our Part C program. We were able to get specific money for Flint for early on as one of those supplemental spending bills that were passed right after the water crisis came to light and came to conversation. But that was the first and really only state dollars or state investment that we've seen into this Part C program. Every other state in the country is putting significant dollars and resources into their intervention program, and they use the federal money as kind of just play money or to try new things and do other stuff with. Michigan has been a real outlier in not investing in this program. We did see, like I said, in the governor's proposal, for the first time, $5 million increase into early on, which is not nearly enough, but it's certainly a start and a step in the right direction. This really came out of the Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley's special education task force. He had a task force. He's on special education issues. They went around the state, heard from a number of people, and really the number one recommendation that came out in the report from that task force was investment into our Part C program, into our early on program. The way the governor had originally proposed it was a bit troubling. They had it as a competitive grant program where ISDs or intermediate school districts would have to apply in a competitive nature for these funds. We've never really done that with special education services or programming before. We've successfully, to this point, kind of, I think, backed the legislature off of that. The Senate version of the bill, the budget bill that passed, like I said, right before spring break, did include the $5 million, but had it distributed through the current formula where the 11 or the 10 and a half or $11.8 million of federal money is distributed. What this has resulted in, and for early on as a program statewide, is really a big discrepancy in the amount of services available or amount of help available for families with an infant or toddler with an identified delay or disability. Intermediate school districts are able to levy special education millages in their local areas, local districts. Virtually all ISDs have a special ed millage. Some of them are much more robust than others. And then the ISDs themselves decide where to spend those special education dollars that they raised locally through their millage. And so we have some programs that have a fairly robust special ed millage and decide to use those funds for their early on program, have a decent early on program, and are providing, maybe an acceptable level of supports and services for families that are eligible. But then we have other areas where they either have a very small special ed millage, or if they have a larger special ed millage, they're using that money in other areas and not on their early on program. So we have no real uniformity around the state, which results in challenging circumstances for a lot of families. That if you live on the wrong side of the county line or you're in the wrong ISD district, you don't have access to nearly the amount of supports and services that your neighboring community might have. So the remedy for that, one of the remedies for that is increased state investment. So we've been making this case for a long time. Like I said, I'm knocking on the podium here, but we're seeing some momentum and some movement here for the first time in the right direction. So that's something we're going to continue to look at and to make sure we're focused on as the budget process continues. So, excuse me. So also with this budget process, like I talked about, so we're currently in, the state is negotiating or working on, the legislature's working on the FY19 state budget right now, which will actually start October 1 of 18, but we're on an October 1 fiscal year, as is the federal government on an October 1 fiscal year as well. What's unique about this year is this opportunity that we have as a result of the federal omnibus budget bill that was just passed a few weeks ago. And I'll back up a little bit and kind of explain how we got to this point, and then we can talk specifically about some of the work that's happening, particular to CCDBG, the Child Care Development Block Grant here in Michigan. But so if you can remember, through the fall and then over Christmas and everywhere, the Congress in Washington was negotiating, trying to reach a deal on a longer-term budget agreement. The Republicans wanted to so backing up to the last government shutdown when President Obama was in office and the Republicans had the Congress, there was a brief government shutdown, and what resulted from that was sequestration spending caps. So they put in these artificial caps on spending levels at the federal government, the federal level, that had been in place continuing through. Both sides wanted to lift those caps. The Republicans really wanted to lift the caps on defense spending. They wanted to increase spending on defense, on the military, and others. The Democrats, for the most part, wanted to lift what we called NDD, the non-defense discretionary spending caps. So all programs, all discretionary funding programs from the federal government, they wanted the caps lifted on those. They ultimately reached an agreement. It wasn't a 1-to-1. I think the agreement was $80 billion for defense spending and $69 or $68 billion for non-defense discretionary was an increase, but it was a significant increase. As part of those negotiations, that's what led to first a passage of another continuing resolution, then ultimately to this budget bill that was just passed for FY18. As part of those negotiations, some specific items were singled out for increased spending. Really, the Senate Democrats in Washington, so Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters were a big part of this. They really prioritized increasing CCDBG and increasing child care as one of their big priorities in these negotiations. And so that's why we ended up with a significant increase to child care spending in both FY18 and FY19. What's important to remember is this agreement was for 2 years. So both FY18, which we're currently operating in, we're over 6 months through right now because it started back on October 1st of 17, and for FY19, the agreement was for 2 years. The bill that was just passed was only for FY18. But so what does that mean for Michigan? So that means significant new child care development block grant funds coming to Michigan. The estimates that I've seen are about $65 million, $65.3 million, I think was the latest that I saw. I know that Caitlin's here from the Office of Great Start. I know that as of this morning, the Office of Great Start has still not received any official declaration or information from the federal government on how that money is going to be coming or how much exactly and in what manner. But it's important to remember this is money for fiscal year 18. Now we do have, I think, under the CCDBG process or the CCDF process, Child Care Development Fund process, 2 years to actually appropriate that money. But you know, there's a lot of improvements that need to be made to the program. So we're anxious to have some discussions. Michigan's Children has been leading a group of advocates around this issue specifically, trying to get some of the advocate voices together and coalesced around ideas on how this money should be prioritized. There's a number of things. So I'm gonna back up a little bit on the CCDBG program itself and kind of where we're at here in Michigan, and then talk about some of the options or ideas for spending this money and moving the program forward. So as Judy identified earlier, the Child Care Development Block Grant Program was reauthorized, 2 years ago? I think a little over 2 years ago. And with that reauthorization came a whole lot of new regulations and requirements on states and then ultimately on providers. And so there's language in the budget bill itself that passed that's appropriating this new money that says these monies should be used to help offset the costs of some of these new regulations and rules that are required under CCDBG. Michigan is in a bit of a unique position because we've already spent some state money to offset some of those. So one of the big requirements is providers are now forced to have background checks and fingerprinting done. Michigan, in our last year's budget, our state budget, we actually appropriated over $5.5 million specifically for those things to happen, for providers to be able to, for the state to reimburse or to pay for providers to get fingerprinting and background checks done. Most other states, I don't know of any other states that appropriated that much money, but most certainly haven't. And so they're looking at things like that now with this new federal money to set up and to provide assistance for. We're fortunate in Michigan that we've already kind of covered that, and as of now, the Office of Great Start feels confident that the plan that they have in place and that they have enough money, state funds, available at least for the first round to get providers set up with background checks and fingerprinting. There are a number of other areas, though, as Judy hinted at, and I'll talk about, where we do have challenges in their system. So first and foremost, I mean, if you look at Michigan's Child Care Development Program, our Child Care Subsidy Program, in comparison to other states, there's a number of areas where we really kind of stick out not in a good way. One is our eligibility. We currently, to be eligible for our program, you need to be at or below 130% of the federal poverty level. That's second or third lowest in the country, depending upon what happens on a year-to-year basis. But we are at the bottom of the list as far as eligibility. Some states have gone as high as 250% or even higher for eligibility into the program. Another is rates, and really two areas of rates. First and foremost is this hourly issue. We still reimburse at an hourly rate structure. We're one of only 3 states that do that still. Everyone else has shifted to at least daily, if not weekly, and some even monthly reimbursements. This is an area where we're out of compliance. The CCDBG rules and regulations that just passed require us to move to at least a daily or weekly payment structure. And so this is an area that we're going to, now that has not been enforced yet, but at some point we're going to have to make that shift. And then on the rates themselves, we have focused or prioritized investments into rates in the last couple of years in our state budget process. And so we're making some progress. We're not as big of an outlier on rates as we are on those other two issues, on eligibility and on this hourly structure. We do tier our rates to the quality rating and improvement system. There is a new market rate analysis that is supposed to come out, I think, this week, certainly in the next couple of weeks, with data from 2017 that'll show us exactly where we're at as far as market rates. The federal suggested rate, I guess it would be, or suggestions in the rules and regulations are to be at least 75% of market rate for your subsidy payments. I'm not sure, we'll see with the data that comes out here in the next couple of weeks. Like I said, we have tiered our reimbursement rates, and we have increased our reimbursement rates in the last couple of years, with that being prioritized in our state budget process. But we're certainly still going to be below that 75, or most likely be below that 75% of market rate in at least some of the tiers. The increases have been non-equitable, I guess, for the last couple of years. So we may be at or above 75% in a couple of the tiers, but not there on some of the other tiers. So we're anxious to see that. But these are areas where obviously we're going to focus on and look at what we could do with more investments. There is a significant cost attached to shifting from the hourly to a weekly or daily rate. We think, this is Matt Gillard, Michigan's Children speaking, we think this is an excellent opportunity to bite the bullet and make that shift. This money, particularly for FY18, that we're already 6 months into this fiscal year, that if we get an extra $60 or $65 million, now is the time to at least seriously consider biting the bullet and making that shift and getting us off of this archaic hourly rate structure. We know that would be a huge benefit to providers. We know that would do wonders for getting more people to engage in the system and be willing to participate in the subsidy system, which are all things we need. So, but there's an ongoing cost to that as well, obviously. What's important to remember with this 2-year agreement from the federal government is that we're certainly expecting, and no reason not to expect, that additional $65 million in our base CCDBG funds for next year as well in FY19. How that'll play out is most likely going to be a continuing resolution. It's very unlikely that, so this current budget deal, or budget bill that was passed will end September 30th. The Congress will be, 6 weeks, 5 weeks before a midterm election. It's unlikely that they have started some work on FY19 budget bills in Washington, but it's very unlikely that they'll pass a full budget before the election, before the midterms. What we're likely to see is a continuing resolution that'll push them past the midterm elections, and then we'll have a full-blown budget discussion after that, and depending upon what happens in those elections, obviously. So we're considering this, and everyone in the field across the country are really considering this the new base number for CCDBG. And so we're going to advocate and fight to keep that. But this is an opportunity for us to look at if with additional federal investments. Another thing that was mentioned before, but just so people are aware, this new money has no additional match requirement. So Michigan has, I alluded to in the question from this morning, we have historically been a real outlier on not even meeting our federal match requirements and turning back federal dollars. That really crystallized in the fall of 2016 when we actually sent back about $17 or $18 million or didn't get $17 or $18 million because we did not come up with about $6.5 or $7 million of state matching funds that were needed. Yes. Sure.
Regarding the literacy change from I think it's K to 3, we have to improve our reading level for the kids. Mm-hmm. Preschool, if I'm a individual provider, I don't belong to EduCare or a ISD, how do I get that money? How do I know, first of all, about these grants? How are you educating the providers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a couple of different things. So one, what's there's a new third grade reading law in Michigan where it's specifically on the public schools, on the K-12 schools, that to be testing reading ability of third graders in order for them to move on to fourth grade. And this has been a trend around the country. We've really had a focus in Michigan on the education side on third grade reading for the last few years. There's been some state money included in that, primarily given through competitive grants to school districts, some to ISDs, but mostly to school districts, to implement specific programs in the early elementary years based on literacy, focused on literacy. I don't know of anything that's available to individual providers as a part of that state funding. Now, I think there's an opportunity with increased CCDBG funds to look at quality improvements for providers and focus those on literacy. That's certainly a worthy discussion, and I think you'd see a lot of potential support for that from the legislature and from the governor, because they are really focused on third grade reading and moving the needle on third grade reading as a benchmark for our education system. So back historically on the CCDBG, so we fall of 2016, for the first time ever, any state has turned back that much money. We made a big deal about it, called out the governor, called out the legislature, saw some progress then from that. Frankly, the governor's next budget proposal that he came out with that next February included a significant increase in state funds into our child care program, put us in a position where we're no longer at risk of turning back federal dollars. Like I said, we prioritized rates, really, with those state increases, and we were also able to get that fingerprinting and background check money and some of these other things in as well with that state increase. And so we're no longer in a position where we need to worry about turning back federal funds. Thanks. Spring break's catching up to me, I guess. But we are, now obviously looking at ways to improve and have a number of areas, as Judy outlined and that I talked about a little bit, on where we could improve with the program. And this is an exciting time. I mean, this is happening around the country. States are all trying to figure out what to do with these increased CCDBG funds. And, Michigan's in a real position to take advantage of this and to start to really make some of the fundamental changes we need to our child care program. I think we're really at a precipice here where things are coming together. Now, I was a part, like I said, I've been a part of early childhood advocacy for a number of years. I was involved throughout the entirety of the pre-K battle, and I liken where we're at in child care right now to where we were at the start of that real discussion about pre-K and the investments in pre-K. We're really starting to see the business community get engaged on the child care issue. The business community got very engaged on the pre-K issue at the end and really helped us push that forward with the Republican governor and Republican legislature and to make that pre-K investment a reality. We're starting to see that same focus and engagement from the business community now on child care. Now on child care, it's a little bit different though. I mean, there is some self-serving interest to the business community's engagement. They really see it as a talent issue. Unemployment's very low. They're fighting with other states for talent, for employees, and they're looking at our child care system as an impediment for them attracting and recruiting talent, which is great. Their focus and their attention is great. It can be a huge help legislatively, but I think it's important for all of us to remember that their goals may not be the same as ours. And I think it's imperative for us as advocates, and especially for the folks in this room, to continue to focus on quality and to keep the discussion moving forward about quality. I think a lot of the discussion from the business community, not all, but a lot of it is going to be focused on eligibility. When I talk, I spoke to a Small Business Association of Michigan talent committee meeting or work group a couple of weeks ago. Well, as soon as you mention 130% of the federal poverty level, you lose them. Very few of these employers that are engaged or businesses that are engaged, their full-time employees are making more than 130% of the federal poverty level. They want a program that can help their employees find and subsidize quality child care options. So they're really going to be focused on eligibility, and we're seeing that from some of the plans and some of the discussion that the business community is leading now. I think it's going to be imperative for those of us in the field, the advocates, and certainly the providers and everybody else, to also continue to beat the drum on quality and why quality matters. And I think one big way to do this, and like I said, we're beginning in the beginning stages of trying to figure out what to do with these increased funds, but making this shift from hourly to weekly payments would do a lot to drive quality, to drive more providers into the system, and to make business models work, frankly, for child care providers. And so, I think we might see the beginnings of kind of this dilemma or this dynamic on opposing forces. But in general, it's a positive. I mean, the more voices we can have about the importance of childcare, the commitment to childcare, and this is happening nationally. I mean, even if you harken back to the last presidential election, the only substantive issue of any kind that both candidates, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, talked about was childcare. Now, they have vastly different ideas or focuses from their plans, but that was the one issue that they both talked about in any way, shape, or form in a similar manner. And that's not by coincidence. This is an issue that's happening, that people are struggling with, that's a real issue in communities and in states across the country. Like I said, in Michigan, we have maybe more challenges than most, or more opportunities, I'd like to say, to improve because of our current system. But there is opportunities, and so this new funding from the federal government could not have come at a better time, and is a real huge opportunity, and for us to take advantage of, I think, is imperative. Yes, Regina.
Do you mind, hi, thank you. Do you mind talking a little bit about the intersection between CCDBG and also the Child Care Development State Plan? It's my understanding that all states, there's a due date for state plans, I think sometime in June. So if you could talk about that. And then additionally, in the work that you're doing with the kind of advocacy partners in the state, are there thoughts about how perhaps the additional CCDBG dollars can help fill some of the gaps that will be lost as a result of Race to the Top coming to an end?
Absolutely. Two good questions. So first, the state plan. My understanding is I think it's a July deadline. I'm looking at Kate. Okay. So, and I think those public hearings are actually starting this week. So there's public hearings. I'm sure you can find that information on the OG Office of Great Start website. I know there's one at MIAYC. Event in Grand Rapids this week. Some of them are webinar, so you can do them from your office as well. These are public hearings that are required. As Regina mentioned, there's a requirement for each state to submit a state plan on where they see their child care system going and what they're going to prioritize and focus from the child care program. And so that plan is in the stages right now, and it's the opportunity for those of us here in this room to comment on and to be engaged in that process. I believe it's a July deadline. And they'll work hard to try to make it available to folks to comment on, and this will drive a lot of our discussion and a lot of our focus moving forward is what ultimately comes out and is submitted as our state plan to the feds for child care. And so this is a great opportunity for people to get engaged. It's good that I think we're going to be having a lot of the discussions that people will want to have, and the process is set up for people to have their voices heard. So it's important to do that. To figure out what your priorities want to be. So second question, so Race to the Top. Michigan was awarded a Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant. I think it was around $55 million maybe. That is set to expire here at the end of this calendar year. So that funding runs through December 31st of 18. I was actually a part of, with some other folks in this room, a Race to the Top sustainability work group where we went through all 55 or 56 programs that were run through the Race to the Top funds and kind of hashed out where we thought prioritization should be given to sustaining which programs and which efforts. This CCDBG, these increased CCDBG funds, could certainly come into play in sustaining some of these programs. One example is the social emotional consulting work that was a part of the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge. So Michigan historically had a model, world-class social emotional consulting program. Unfortunately, funding was cut back in the early 2000s, I think, even for that program. This was back in the 90s. And now other states have modeled their programs after what we used to run here in Michigan. We were able to re-implement a version of that program with some of the Race to the Top funds, providing social and emotional consulting services to providers. There's a real effort underway, and I think a lot of hope for being able to continue and even build that program. But there's a number of other programs from the Race to the Top funding as well that were successful in helping improve quality and focused on childcare especially. And so I think those discussions will certainly continue, and we'll continue to see where we can get support and legislative approval and find funding matches or opportunities for funding for some of these programs, like the social emotional consulting program for one. Any other questions about that stuff or anything else? So I'm going to talk about the election, but I will certainly still answer any questions about funding, about CCDBG or anything else. So, I mean, as I said, we're in the midst of the state budget process. The legislature is going to, in the next few weeks, here in a couple months at least, determine how these funds are spent. So these increased CCDBG funds will be appropriated in our state budget, and whether that's through rate increases or eligibility increases or switching to a weekly payment. We're in the process of trying to get cost estimates on these different options right now, so that we can see how much it will actually cost if we wanted to switch to a weekly rate, how much it would cost every 5 points or however much we could raise eligibility to the program. And then obviously with rates as well, we can do cost estimates on that and on where rates would go. Yes?
I stress the issue about facilities. And I've had some very early on conversations at the state level as well last year about Michigan not typically being a facilities state, meaning actually investing in real capital to renovate classrooms and to address the facility issue. But I think the message is often lost in understanding that ultimately if a child, especially in Detroit, is sitting in a classroom with a leaky roof, the mold is fumigating, the stench from the smell and the humidity in the classrooms really do have an impact in terms of that child's ability to learn. So I'm just wondering, where does that sit in the conversation? Because providers cannot afford debt to acquire buildings. You know that I'm sure that the federal government doesn't necessarily allow them to own facilities without going through a very complicated process. So it leaves them very vulnerable as it relates to actual facilities. And in fact, Detroit is giving back Head Start slots because they can't deal with facilities. So, again, I don't know if I necessarily have a question, but it's really more about continuing to raise the awareness of how do we plan to address this, because even if you have a program quality, if that child is sick in that classroom every day, we're still not necessarily accomplishing what we need to accomplish.
You're absolutely right. We have a facilities issue in our early childhood programming. We have a facilities issue in our K-12 education programs as well. So I get a few different thoughts on the question or on the topic. There were some of the Race to the Top programs that were specifically related to facilities and providing money, grants, competitive grants, or other things to providers to improve facilities. And so that's one of the parts of the discussion about sustainability. Is there funding available? Is there support to sustain those programs or even expand them to provide more opportunities for providers to improve and update their facilities? I'm certain it was not enough, and I'm certain there's way more that needs to be done. The reason I alluded to the K-12 discussion as well is we're on the verge as well of really having a broad discussion here in this state about how we fund public education. I'm a part of a school finance research collaborative, which is a group of folks from around the state that really want to drive that discussion, that have done some, financed some adequacy and equity studies on school finance, and that really show where we're lacking and where the problem is. What's important, though, is those studies that have been done, and the conversation to this point has not included facilities. Now, it needs to, and we know that. The group that I'm a part of thought that might be too big to bite off at one time, so they're looking specifically at funding models, but not facilities. But that discussion is coming, and it's going to come around the K-12 context. I think it's imperative for those of us who are interested in early childhood programming, and childcare in particular, to make sure that we include early childhood, and child care facilities in that discussion. Because we're going to have a discussion. This election is going to be a tipping point for us around public education issues and financing issues in general. But we need facilities to be included in that conversation, and we need facilities for child care and early childhood programs to be included in that conversation too. And that's going to take a concerted effort from everybody who cares about it to make sure that it's part of that discussion. But it's cannot be avoided moving forward. And I really do think the K-12 issue is what's going to drive it. But we need to be a part of it. Any other questions? Those are good questions. So back to CCDBG elections talk a little bit. So I've alluded to it too. I think it's impossible to overstate how important this upcoming election is here in Michigan. We are at a fork in the road. And I think really what's decided in this 2018 election, we'll have a new governor elected, the entire legislature is up, all the Senate seats, all the House of Rep seats. We have a number of competitive congressional races for the first time in a long time, both in the primary and in the general potentially, in the U.S. Senate race as well. And it's from being involved in the political side of things here in Michigan for as long as I have, it's really striking how important this election is for issues like early childhood, issues like child care, issues like K-12 education and everything else. Michigan's going to go one of two directions after this election in November, and it's going to be determined by who gets elected. And so we need everybody to engage. Michigan's Children, we don't endorse candidates, we don't do that, but we really try to be a resource for people on issues. Elections are a huge opportunity from an advocacy standpoint. You get people talking about things that they otherwise wouldn't. Not necessarily yet, because we're still a little early, but you get in September, October, you have people having conversations around their breakfast table, around their dinner table about policy issues that just doesn't happen any other times of the year. And so we want to make sure that they're talking about the issues that are important to us and that candidates are hearing about from potential voters, issues that are important to us. And we have a real opportunity to do that with this election. It's going to be fascinating to watch. There's a fascinating political environment being created around the country, not just here in Michigan, but there's a lot at stake here in Michigan, particularly in 2018. And so we'll have a lot of information on our website. There's other options out there for people to learn about candidates, learn about issues that we think are important. I'll highlight a couple real quick. Judy mentioned earlier that Louisiana has a real progressive child care tax credit package that's really aimed at supporting the workforce and supporting providers. I went to a conference down in Louisiana 3 or 4 years ago with Susan Broman, the former director of Office of Great Start, and a few other folks from Michigan. We heard about their tax credit package. It had been in place for a couple of years at that time. Got all excited about it, came back here to Michigan. We got commissioned a study. We had Mitch Bean and Bob Klein. Bob Klein was a former state treasurer. Mitch Bean was a former House Fiscal Agency director. They had their own consulting business. We had them do a study on what this impact could be in Michigan, how this could work in Michigan. Showed great things, great potential. And then right at about that time, if you can remember, this was a couple years ago, the tax credit scare, the advanced manufacturing battery credits, and some others that had been passed back in the Granholm administration were starting to come due. And and nobody really knew how much the state was on the hook for. So there was this real fear in Lansing that they were going to be billions of dollars and the state was going to be broke because these tax credits that had been passed the decade before were starting to come due, and the state was owing these Ford Motor Company and General Motors and all these others these big tax credit bills. And so tax credits became a dirty word in Lansing. And the governor came out hard and said, I'm not supporting any tax credits. It's a bad idea. It's bad fiscally. And so we kind of put that in the shelf, then took a report, put it in the drawer. But now we think it's time to unveil it and to bring it back out. And so we're starting to have those conversations already with gubernatorial candidates, with some legislative candidates. There's real opportunity to provide significant support to the workforce and to providers and to families Louisiana tiered doors to their quality system, so you get a bigger credit for your working in a better quality facility or program. And for parents, for families, you get a bigger credit for choosing a higher quality program. So it's a way to incentivize quality, like we do with the tiered reimbursement systems, or tiered reimbursements as well. But these are refundable tax credits that could have a significant impact on the workforce and on providers. And so we think this is a great opportunity as an election issue to get folks on the record on, to get them knowledgeable about, and that we can hopefully hit the ground running in 2019 with a new administration, new legislature, and maybe get some of this stuff done. It's a little ironic for me. When I was in the House, I actually chaired the school aid budget and the K-12 budget, and I voted against every tax credit bill that came up because it went less money that I would have in my budget to fund things like pre-K and other stuff. But I qualify that as saying nobody ever brought a child care tax credit package before the legislature when I was in office. So, it is challenging for us as an advocacy organization that oftentimes is, not supporting a lot of the tax credit legislation, or always being concerned about our budget not being big enough and not having adequate funding for programs to be pitching a tax credit package that's going to actually mean less money for the state. But we think it's a worthwhile discussion and certainly meritorious in its content and in the way that it could help really help providers and families, and really incentivize the quality system. So that's one example, I think, of where we can have some, hopefully more discussion with with candidates and through this election process. There's a number of other ways as well. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. The youth are really engaged, more than we've ever seen. This isn't early childhood related, but we're getting drawn into a whole lot of conversations about school safety. And the students are organized and are going to make this an issue and make an interesting dynamic politically in this election that we haven't seen. At least in my lifetime. Any other questions? I could keep talking. Hmm? 5 minutes? I got 5 minutes left? Okay. No, I want to thank you again for all the work that you do. Really, we want to be a resource. We want to be a help to folks. There's a lot of other organizations that we work with as well. The state plan's a great opportunity for people to voice their opinions on the direction of our child care system. And like I said, the upcoming election is going to be critical for this state and for us moving forward. And so if you have any questions, michiganschildren.org. My email is just Matt, M-A-T-T, at michiganschildren.org. Email us, call us. We can help you get engaged in any way you want. Yes? Got a question. Sure.
So in the last panel discussion I went to, the issue of sort of picking our battles came up, and that we need to have a united voice, and it can't be a united voice about 10 different things. In this group, what would you say, what do you want us and our colleagues and our people to do? What are the 3 things you would have us do?
Good, great question. No, absolutely. And I mean, that's how our Michigan's Children organizationally, we're set up to be opportunistic. I mean, you have to be successful as an advocacy organization. You've got to either take advantage of opportunities when they present themselves or do the work behind the scenes to create the opportunities. And that's really our business model, in a simple way from an advocacy perspective. But there are some opportunities out there. And so I would say childcare is a huge opportunity for us right now. This new federal money, but just the issue with the general public is there. People are concerned about it. The business community is engaged. I think there's a real opportunity for us to really make some headway on childcare here in the state. And as Judy said, and as I've said too, we've got a long ways to go, but there is a real opportunity. So I would encourage people, and I think what's most important, as I mentioned earlier from people in this room, is we have to keep the focus on quality. I'm concerned that there'll be this big movement on childcare, but if it's all just on eligibility and we lose focus on quality, we're not necessarily moving the needle for kids in the way that we want. And so I think people that care about this issue, the people in this room, really need to be a part of this child care conversation, lead the conversation, and keep the focus on quality. I think that's going to be imperative for us moving forward. And I think we can do it, and I think, we'll get support, and it's going to take a broad coalition of folks, the business community included, to really get to where we want to go with our child care system. But I think that that's going to have to be a priority, certainly for our organization and for like-minded folks that want to see these movements, is that we really got to focus on quality and keep quality at the top of the list in everything that we're talking about.
Good afternoon. I do agree with you that we need to keep a focus on quality, but I think we also need to keep in mind that not all sites are able to attain the quality that we're thinking about. I think the concern I have is that when we talk about quality has a lot of component to it. Somebody talked about facility. Teacher qualification is another huge thing. Active parental engagement, support, and education is part of quality. My only concern is that when we talk about quality, the bigger systems like the ISDs, the program they're running, they're able to pull the teachers that with the higher credential, and then the neighborhood-based programs don't have access to that. So I feel that we need to be careful so that we don't have unintended consequences. If we're going to talk about quality, we need to have money in it to make sure that the community-based organization that don't have the money to hire because they cannot afford to put teachers on contract, they can pay higher wages and all that, get a little bit more money to support. I just feel like the people who have more access is getting it, and the community-based organization are not getting it. I don't want the effort that we have made in state of Michigan, getting a lot of people excited. We need to put more money in teacher training. We have a lot of teachers that have associate degree, CDA, that we need to intensify training on it. We're all waiting for people to graduate from a 4-year college, and you hire them, they teach for 1 year, and then they go into a school system, and we start the cycle all over again. So if we're really going to talk about quality, we need to sit down and break it down and figure out where do we put money to get the most bang out of the buck versus just talking about it. So just make sure that the community-based the small-scale preschool programs are not losing, because the school systems cannot afford to take all the 4-year-old children in the state of Michigan. Most school systems have 1 classroom or preschool classroom. So, so make sure that we get the CBOs involved too.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely, and I think it's a great point. I think the state plan is a great opportunity for those comments to be heard and to be directed. The state plan is going to drive a lot of our efforts on improving quality and to making sure that CBOs and others are able to do it. And I'll just point back to one example, I think, of where, when I talk about we need to keep the focus on quality, this shift from an hourly to a weekly payment, in my mind, would be a huge benefit to everybody across the system, and a way to help people improve quality. But it's going to be expensive, and there are going to be voices out there that want to increase just eligibility, use the entire $65 million just to get our eligibility threshold up to as high as we can get it. But this is an example, I think, of the dynamic. There are changes we can make that will help everybody, but then there needs to be a continued focus for the CBOs and for everybody else. I agree completely. And a lot of the Race to the Top programs were aimed at trying to do that. Some were successful, some not, with parental engagement and this other thing. I mean, one of the areas where we've done a lousy job, I think, in Michigan to a big extent as well, is with parental engagement. And we need to figure that out. We need to do better and support providers in getting parents engaged. I'd love to see it around the elections, but I think in general, we want to do a better job of getting parental engagement across the spectrum. Well, thanks again.
All right, thank you, Matt. Now we have a short break, and we're going to transition to our afternoon sessions. They'll start exactly at 1:30, so I'm going to let you know where they are. And Suite A is the right drivers. implementing early childhood leading practices. Suite E is collaboration is key to lasting impact in early childhood education. And finally, in F, did I say E? F. And in E, responses caregiving leads to healthy social-emotional development. Again, please remember to complete the evaluation at the end of the session. Is informative to both the panelists and to the summit planners, and return here at 3 o'clock for our closing plenary. Remember to keep on tweeting or using your social media at #MichiganKids. Thank you.